Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Youth Sexual Exploitation and Human Trafficking Awareness. My name is Jessica, and I'll be your host for this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we, the New Brunswick Adoption Foundation, are a provincial entity. We acknowledge that we carry out our work on the traditional unceded territory of the Willsquoi, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which these nations first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Willsquoi titles and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We, the staff and members of the board, pay respect to the elders, past and present, and the descendants of this land. We honor the knowledge keepers and seek their guidance as we strive to develop closer relationships with the Indigenous people in New Brunswick. As an organization focused on vulnerable children in the care system, we express these words with both humility and hope. Before we dive into our webinar tonight, I want to take a moment to remind everyone about our network and our upcoming programming. The New Brunswick Adoption Foundation is a nonprofit organization that aims to promote and advocate for children in permanent care of the province. Our vision is that every child or youth in the permanent care of the province finds a permanent family. We have some great programming coming up, including While You're Waiting next week on Tuesday and Late Night Talks with Kim next Thursday. And our next webinar will be on May 13th with our speaker from NeuroWild. A couple housekeeping items. So to get the most of our presentation tonight, I encourage everyone to switch to speaker view so that you can focus on our presenter. We love engagement here, so please do use the chat feature throughout the presentation to ask your questions or state your comments. You can find the chat by pushing those three little dots in the bottom of your screen, and feel free also to use the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen as well if you'd like to ask your question. If you're following along live on our Facebook group, go ahead and ask your questions there as well. At the end of the presentation, we will be turning off our live video for the Q&A session. And if you're joining us live on Facebook, please do register for future webinars if you'd like to take part in this session. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a brief poll for you to complete. And we'd greatly appreciate if you could just take a moment to answer those 5 questions. Your feedback is invaluable to supporting our ongoing work. So tonight, our goal is to understand more about the topic of sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And I'm very excited to have Ashley MacDonald here with us to help us understand this topic a little more. Ashley?
Thank you very much. Hi, folks. Thank you very much for having me. And thank you to everyone who's here at 8 p.m. I know you all have busy days and you're tired and you're taking the time to be here. So thank you for that. It's a really important topic, and everybody here has a role to play in eradicating trafficking and exploitation from the world and preventing it. So let's get right into that. So again, my name is Ashley MacDonald. I'm here from YWCA Moncton, and we're going to talk about youth sexual exploitation and human trafficking with a youth lens. So we're going to talk about strength-based strategies for prevention and care. Another land acknowledgement, and this one is specific to YWCA Moncton and where we operate most of our work from. So the YWCA Moncton respectfully acknowledges that we live, work, and play in the unceded traditional home of the Mi'kmaq. Today and every day, our agency stands in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of this land, and we're all treaty people. And unfortunately, Indigenous folks are overrepresented in those who experience trafficking and exploitation. And so we need to be really intentional and client-centered and trauma-informed and collaborative when we're doing this work. And it is part of reconciliation work as well. So how we do this work from the YWCA, I will say right from the get-go, I'm not a survivor of human trafficking or sexual exploitation. So I don't consider myself an expert because they're the experts. However, I would say I'm an expert with connecting with youth. That's what I've done through the majority of my 20 or so years of social work is worked in different capacities with vulnerable youth. So that is our approach to doing this. We're great at connecting with youth, and now we've developed an anti-trafficking framework that we've placed on the work that we're already doing. And that's my hope for everybody here, that you can develop this framework for the kiddos in your lives, in your homes, if you work with kiddos, and just apply it to what you're already doing. So this framework we're talking about is strength-based. It's youth-informed and led. It's survivor-informed, and it's really at its heart about prevention and connection. If folks have heard about Brave YW before, which is our anti-trafficking, one of our anti-trafficking projects at the YW, they might often think of or have heard like intervention models. And certainly we have youth on our caseload and have had youth who have experienced trafficking or exploitation, but it's preventative at heart. So certainly we do work with them, those who have just left it or who are engaged in it or who have experienced it previously, but prevention at heart. So we'll talk a lot about preventative measures tonight as well. Before we get right into what Brave is and then the rest of the presentation, a few things first. So the many hats that I wear, as we all do, I'll say I'm a mom. I have a 5-year-old girl. Why is that relevant to this presentation? I'm going to give you guys a lot of great advice, a lot of great information, and you're going to make sense with it for your home and your family. Am I going to do everything I'm going to say on the screen when my kiddo, when we're, 6 years down the road and she's in the throes of middle school? Who knows how we'll make sense of it? So I do understand that giving you good information, it doesn't necessarily play out that way in your personal lives. And I fully get that. I usually joke that I've got a really comfy cave coming up for my kiddo with shag rugs and like food, and she's gonna love it in there, and she's never gonna go on the internet and all these things. But of course, that's not the reality. But I do understand the parental fears and all of that jazz. I'm also a social worker by profession, so I understand the social worker perspective as well. And I've worked with kids in care through my entire career. So I understand the barriers, the discrimination, the lack of the whole world being trauma-informed, the lack of resources, just wanting to do your best, the neurodivergence, all of that. That's been the bulk of my career. So I'm really excited to share this information with this audience. So that being said, we're going to talk about Brave for a second, but actually let me back up. I want to mention 3 common disclaimers, if you will, about this presentation that come up time and time again. So there's 3 things we learned when we started with the Brave project about 5 years ago that have just rung true time and time again. So 1, as you start to learn about human trafficking and exploitation, you may start to think that everyone's being trafficked. Folks told me that in the beginning, and I was like, no. I mean, there's been times where I'm like, everyone's being trafficked. So everyone is not being trafficked. So if you find yourself feeling that way tonight, a year down the road, please hear my voice and know that it's not true, and you have to ground yourself in that reality, because we can't operate in a healthy manner from a perspective that everyone's being trafficked, because they're not. Secondly, you might chuckle a little. All of these actually I've chuckled with, but they're all true. Anti-trafficking work can lead you to hate men. This is not fair to the men of the world. There are stats that are skewed very heavily in one direction. We're learning a lot more about those who are targeted and whatnot, and we're going to talk about that, but it's not fair to hate all the men of the world, because there's some bad ones out there. So again, if you find yourself reflecting those thoughts in relation to this stuff, it's just time to check in and balance that out somewhere, because certainly the world's filled with lots of great men. Lastly, it can be a triggering topic for a variety of reasons. So please do take good care and step away if you need to step away. Ask for help if you need help. Get the care that you need. You can reach out to us at the YW, whoever your support people are. Something that happens not often, but regularly, is folks actually start to realize that they may have been trafficked, or they are in the situation, or someone they know is maybe in this, and it's identified in the workshop. So if that's the case, all I say is unpacking that live in a question in the workshop is not the best place for it because it could potentially put people at risk. But happy to support you, and you can reach out afterwards and find us at the YW. We don't want to unpack that live. But you can certainly send private messages as well, and you'll have all the contact information to reach out to us. And I'll also be identifying other resources that can help with all the umbrella topics that really fit under sexual exploitation. So without further ado, also pause. If you do want to share something in the question time or popcorn style during the presentation, you can, if it's something you want to bring up, but you have to just anonymize it. So it could be, oh, this one person, this one thing happened, not like Sally, my kiddo, or my next door neighbor, just to clarify. Okay, with those things aside, let's talk about what BRAVE is before we get into the rest of human trafficking and youth sexual exploitation. So if you've heard about YWCA, you may have also heard about our BRAVE project. So we've had it for about 5 years. And we've been very fortunate that our funding has been extended 2 years in a row so that we get to keep doing this work. So the project has 2 components. One is the direct work with youth, vulnerable youth, aged 11 to 19. And BRAVE is really tailored towards girls and gender diverse youth. However, we have another anti-trafficking project that works with the demographics that aren't captured in that. There's a less narrow age bracket. There's no gender criteria. So really, if this is stuff that you're dealing with in your life or professionally, you could reach out to us. And we always say our door is the right door for everyone. Because even if we can't serve you or meet your need through one of our services, we're going to navigate the community to hopefully get you connected to what you need. And trafficking informed resources in New Brunswick are few and far between. I can count them on one hand. So we do direct work with that demographic of kiddos. Sorry, I say kiddos all the time. They are youth, they are young adults. And the program, the work can be delivered one-to-one. So it's actually a mentoring program. And the youth is paired with a BRAVE staff. It can be delivered through groups in schools usually. And yeah, one-on-one groups, schools. It meets the needs of the youth really. So what's going on with the kiddo, and then we try and wrap the program around that kiddo. Schools are always the best place to meet because when we're dealing with the most vulnerable youth, if we can't get them in school, often we can't get them anywhere. So these might be youth who are just overstimulated at home. There could be trauma going on at home. There could be just a lot of distractions at home. There could be just a lot going on. And a lot of the like really vulnerable youth that we're dealing with who might be coping with, you know, substances and homelessness and, you know, these really big things. Yeah, if we're not getting them in school, they're in pure survival mode outside of school, unfortunately. Not that we don't, it's just school is a safe place for so many reasons. So it's the work that we do. What do we do with them? It's really dependent. So youth are referred, they can self-refer. Typically they're referred from service providers, social development. Teachers are honestly probably the biggest referral source. Could be a caring neighbor, sometimes it's parents, but I would say any school official and ISD school, you know, they're probably the biggest referral source. And the biggest reason to be referred to BRAVE is, or the most common, is unsafe online practices, which I'm sure we can all relate to. And if we're not supporting a person who's navigating a digital world, there's probably some trepidation about what that's like because that world changes so much with, I mean, weekly, monthly, yearly. It's a lot different than it was 10 years ago. So it's intensive case management with wraparound supports. So when we have a youth referred, there on the intake form, there's like, what are the vulnerabilities? So we're going to identify the vulnerabilities so that we can build protective factors around them. So if it's low self-esteem, then our goal is to improve self-esteem. But that's what's on the form. The first thing we do is we do a meet and greet with the youth so we can see like how we click. If we don't click, do we need to bring a different mentor? Do we have shared interests? Because that might be awesome if that's the case, because I mean, we can knit or scrapbook or whatever and just have that organic connection through activities like that. But healthy relationships, online safety, basic needs, you know, food, shelter, sexual health, mental health, substances. It's all these topics that make someone well, self-confidence, how to ask for help, what's available in the community, future goals, what do you want to do in 5 years, how to express yourself, how to build personal agency. This is all the work that we do, and often it's through outings, crafts, and just being like ridiculous and silly. Car rides are a big one. We had a youth who loved seeing cows. I don't know if they just didn't travel if the family didn't have cars and they weren't going somewhere where they could see cows. So their mentor would pick them up and they'd go, whatever, 20 minutes outside of town, and they just drive and talk, look at cows. So really built to what's going on with the youth and that direct them leading the ship. When we meet them, we say, we just want to be your biggest cheerleader and you lead the ship. So if it's not working for you, it's not working for us, and we have to adapt. So that's the work with youth. There's no, you're doing great. So after a year, we're gonna, kick you out of the program and free up the spot. There's no end date to how long they can be in the program. I really believe that longevity, when we're dealing with youth, but especially youth with trauma, is really critical. I've been so privileged in my career to stay at agencies for long periods of time. The last one was a decade. It was a YW in the Northwest Territories. And then I came here and I've been here for 5 years. So, in the North, there was little kiddos that I met when they were 7 and 8. And then they were graduating high school and all these, and I saw that whole thing. And sometimes when they share some of the hard stuff that they're going through, it's in the year 6 of their relationship. So the longevity piece is really, really important for being trauma-informed, client-centered, and working with vulnerable folks. And that is how we operate through the BRAVE project. And it's intensive case management and wraparound supports. So when we're talking about wraparound supports, really thinking about, everything, but think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So we really want to make sure that bottom rung is met so that we can build up. And until we can do that, we wrap around. So we do have housing programs. So we might house a youth or try and get them into housing or advocate for their next stage in housing. So of course, there's a housing crisis. It's not like if you're all getting excited that we have a whole bunch of like housing options, they're there. But of course, there's a housing crisis. And then we service navigate. So like we can accompany them to appointments and a lot of grounding work. That's that intensive case management. So sometimes I can meet with a youth for a couple days a week because they're in crisis period. Very few basic needs are being met. Other times a mentor might meet a youth for an hour a week or an hour a month if they're doing really well and they just need that check-in. So it's very individualized. So that's the youth work with BRAVE. And the other part is doing things like this. So we're raising community awareness about what human trafficking and sexual exploitation is so that the community can better recognize and respond to the issue. And that's our hope. So we offer the workshops, we've done trainings and brought in service providers and community folks. But that's the BRAVE YW project. We'll just get on to the rest of the content, but feel free to ask questions popcorn style, put them in all the chat platforms everywhere. I know we're on Facebook and different platforms. That's generally my facilitation style. So a couple things, definitions before we move on. And I want to specify that I will use the terms human trafficking and youth sexual exploitation interchangeably throughout the presentation. They're not the same. Notably, though, the differences are criminal code differences. And I usually say, I usually do these presentations to specific audiences. So like for this agency and that agency, sometimes they're open to the general public. But for the most part, I usually say that, we're not, but this could be wrong. I could have lawyers here and RCMP officers here, but generally speaking, as community members, we don't need to know the nuances in the legal criminal code differences between human trafficking and youth sexual exploitation. And you can learn that easily Googling blah, blah, blah. What's really important actually is we can recognize something and act on it in a way that's meaningful. And that doesn't have to do with what the definition of human trafficking is. And by the time that we're looking at like, is this human trafficking really? And we might be making some bigger moves according to what we think about that. Someone else is involved, the people who really need to know the criminal code and is this, that, or is what. So we don't need to know that. If there's lawyers in here, disregard that. You definitely need to know that. But then I say too, I'm not an expert on the Criminal Code of Canada. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an expert at connecting with youth. So I will, if anybody has questions and I can't answer them, I'm going to say, I'm not sure, but I'm really happy to look into that and get some information. But we're the youth folks, and we have developed this great anti-trafficking lens that we just put onto the work we're doing. That being said, let's talk about the definitions, and just know that I use the terms interchangeably for the sake of the presentation. I also do that with gendered terms. So we'll also say like she was trafficked, he trafficked. The stats overwhelmingly refer to that reality, but it's not the only reality. Anybody can traffic and anyone can be trafficked. So take those pieces with a grain of salt. So the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So this is talking about CSEC is the acronym, the invitation or counseling of sexual acts, and the person who's being targeted, exploited, taken advantage of, what have you, is vulnerable due to their age and their lack of meeting their basic needs. So minors are vulnerable to trafficking because they are minors. You can compound that with so many intersections of vulnerability, but the most privileged, well-raised, every opportunity, all of that youth is still vulnerable because they're a youth. So that's important to know. And then we can place other vulnerabilities on there, like family violence, being rural, childhood sexual abuse, in and out of the system. These all compound that vulnerability. Another thing that's important with this perspective, oh, and sorry, vulnerable due to a lack of basic needs really speaks to minors or children cannot meet their basic needs. They're completely dependent on adults to help them meet their needs. And if a young person is meeting their own needs without adults providing that for them, this is a youth in survival mode who, again, is hyper vulnerable to being trafficked because people need somewhere to sleep no matter what. So age of consent laws are also important with this, right? Because we're talking about sexual activity and minors. So we are going to talk about that a little bit later. And what's really important to know, and it's so very, very, very often, almost always left out of consent conversations, is minors cannot legally engage in sex work, which is slightly infuriating to me because we have these terms, these popular terms, some are even embedded into the criminal code, that allude to a different reality. For example, child pornography. That's written into the criminal code. It doesn't exist, in my opinion, because saying pornography, if someone is engaged in it, alludes to someone consenting to be in it, to choosing to engage in child pornography. Children can never consent to it, so they're not engaged. And actually, if a child is engaged in selling sex through pornography or whatever it is, they're being sexually exploited and or trafficked. End story. It's like an oxymoron. But I mention that because it's almost always left out of consent education. And in fact, the only educational material that I've seen that points this out is an RCMP brochure, which is amazing. I mean, they definitely need to be informed, and that's wonderful, but almost always left out. So something to think about. And if you're like, well, those are awkward conversations already with my kiddo, I don't know if I want to broach that topic. They are talking about it. It is so normalized to them. And I will tell you so many stories about that, but like, and they might not be talking about child pornography. Maybe they are, but they're talking about selling nudes on Snapchat. And if they're a minor, what does that mean? So it's in their world, unless you control the world completely, which we don't really because they go to school. They have this whole world outside of our home, usually, not always. But that's a really important conversation to have, especially for vulnerable youth who might actually think that this is a viable means to bring in money because no one's actually ever told them not to, and all their friends are doing it. So just a really important consent piece. So this is the definition of sexual exploitation. And what's important to note here, and I'll give you an example. Let's say there's a little girl who's babysat by her neighbor, a man, and when she's being babysat by him, she has to do sexual activities with him, which is, of course, sexual abuse, but she is vulnerable. She can't meet her needs by herself, so she can't care for herself. She needs a caretaker. That's why she's being sent there. The age is huge because that man is manipulating her because he knows he can, because he's a caregiver. She's little, he's big. There's trust, maybe threats, all that jazz. Age of consent laws, may or not may, like, he's a babysitter, so we can assume that it's not there, but she's not consenting, so it doesn't even matter. And so this could be an example of commercial sexual exploitation of children. He's manipulating his power and authority over that child for his own benefit, which would be sexual gratification for him. Awful sexual abuse. I'm not trying to say anything good about it. But so that's between two people, a young person being manipulated due to their vulnerability in a sexual manner. Now we take that and we compare this to human trafficking definition. So this definition, you can see it in a lot of different ways. And it is important when you're doing online research to make sure you're getting some good Canadian content, because there are there are various legal differences, laws in different countries. Like even the age of consent to sexual activity is different in different countries, so it'll be applied differently. So there's lots of great information out there about trafficking and exploitation, but it's really important to get some good Canadian content. And I will tell you about some resources that you can follow in your social media and just get that in your social media feed. It's just a really great way to kind of have the information coming all the time at you without doing any work, so to speak. So this is the AMP model of human trafficking definition. Every definition is not the AMP model. This is a United Nations framework. So AMP stands for action, means, purpose. So you need to have one from each of these first two columns to meet one of the definitions in the last one. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're talking about sexual exploitation. There are other forms of exploitation, such as labor trafficking, organ trafficking, but sexual exploitation or trafficking for the sake of this presentation. So let's break this down a little bit. So you'll see down at the bottom, there's that plus and it says a third party. So back in the day, a few years ago when we were doing this, we used to get a lot of questions actually about the differences between the two. And I don't really get any anymore. So I think we're doing a better job at breaking them down. But we used to put this up here and people would think that, you know, if all these bullet points are present, that it might be trafficking. Only one of these bullet points in the first two columns needs to be present for that person to potentially be involved in trafficking. And I'll give you an example. Let's say we have a girl who thinks she won the big shots and she's got a modeling job coming up. Driver's going to pick her up, take her to the shoot. She's going to go do her shoot, become famous, get paid, all the things. The taxi driver that picks her up is actually taking a side job and he's doing taxi runs off the books for a trafficker. So this girl thinks she's going to her modeling shoot, gets picked up by the taxi driver. So this taxi driver is transferring or transporting. So there's the action in the AMP model. How is he doing it? The means, through deception. I'm just a regular taxi driver and I'm just taking to your dream job. Come on in, no problem here. And the end game, of course, is in that example, she could be going into pornography that she did not consent to. And that could be the definition, the purpose there would be sex trafficking. So just an example, that was just a taxi driver that drove her from point A to point B. And maybe that taxi driver didn't know he was taking this side job from a trafficker. Who knows? Like some trafficking setups are very small. It might be a trafficker who doesn't know what he's doing. He's not good at his job and he's just randomly doing things and seeing what works. And then of course we have these really big criminal enterprises that are quite sophisticated. So we can have varying differentiations between what the actions are. And does one person do all of these things? Does he have staff? Because bigger ones have staff. They'll have bookkeepers and bookers, bookkeepers and bookers. So like they're booking photo shoots or whatever. So lots of different jobs. So one needs to be present, but from each of those columns. But what's really notable with the legal definition of human trafficking versus what we just saw is the presence of a third party. So what that might look like, or what that means, is that it's more than two people. What that might look like is using that example that we just gave. So taxi driver and the girl, two people, but she's showing up somewhere else. Someone else is going to film her, manipulate her, force her, threaten her, whatever that might be. But really, even beyond that, if she showed up to a camera with no human and the camera was just randomly taking pictures, the third party would be the audience. So that film, let's say they've made a film that's going to be sold online, then it's going to be viewed over and over and over again. So two plus people. And that's a key piece of the definition. The criminal code definition of human trafficking is more than two people, the third party. And you know, folks often think that people who are being trafficked they're literally held, they're chained up in a room somewhere and they're never going to get out. But trafficked folks often freely come and go in the community. They might live at their house. Everything might seem normal. They might be engaging in the activities without realizing what they're caught up in. So this is really talking about coercion and deception. They might seem so willingly engaged, but there's something else going on there. And even if fully aware of kind of the depth of what they're caught up in, they go through stages of luring and grooming that normalize the existence that they're in when they're dealing with all of that. And we're going to get into that. So, two definitions that really aren't super important for how you are going to impact the world in making it safer with human trafficking and sexual exploitation. We're going to talk about really what we can do as foster parents, adoptive parents, any parents, grandparents, healthy neighbors, aunties, all of this, maybe as service providers. What can we do to protect the youth and make communities safer? Let's unpack some things first. Sorry, there's just something floating on my screen right in front of the words. This can be a place where you guys might want to engage. This one's harder, but if we were in person, this would be tell me about myths you've heard. But for the sake of the webinars, I go through them. But you can jump in if you have a myth you've heard or something like that. And what I would say is what I'd like you to think about as we go through these, or right now, is when was the first time that trafficking, exploitation, whatever we're calling it, came into your peripheral? When did you kind of realize this was going on in the world? And I'll share my example. My mom grew up like she's a news person. News is always on. It's the American news. I hope she stopped that. It's always on. So I grew up with news programs. So I knew the news anchors. And 2020, if folks don't know what 2020 is, it's like a Dateline, like evening news broadcast, documentary style. Anyways, on it one evening was sex tourism in Thailand. What's that? It's basically privileged North American men going over, leaving their families, going over to Thailand, sexually abusing little girls or little boys, and then returning home to their families. So for a long time, because this was my only reference point, the internet was not what it is today, back then, dial-up times. There was no reference point to challenge that. So for a long time, this was, not that I was spending a ton of time thinking about it, but if I was, this was my reference point. Was I thinking about it happening in my community? No. Did I believe the myths? If I knew any of the myths, brought all of them. And it's really important that we address the myths, because almost everybody's education about trafficking comes from the media, and it is almost always wrong. So we need to unpack that. So that's what we're going to do here. But think about, what's your reference point? Where are you coming from? Like, when did it first enter your world that this was something going on? So myth number one, they chose it. This too is an oxymoron, like child pornography. You can't choose to be exploited. It's impossible. You just can't do that. So they didn't choose it. So if you're ever in a spot where somebody's saying that, or you're reflecting on that, or you're like, no, cannot choose to be exploited. Like the opposite of what the definition of it is. So no, that's a myth. They want attention. So this is one of my favorite things to unpack in the world. So humans need attention. It is a human need. So a few things about this, but if you are saying this, reflecting on this, you're hearing this being said about someone, you can say, yeah, maybe she does need attention. Maybe they need attention because they're humans. If you're not in a spot where you need attention, it's because your needs are met. Maslow's hierarchy, I mean, you've got a lot of that met, that you're not doing something, that you're trying to seek something from others. So, and that's privilege. So if we're thinking this about someone else as a service provider, as a parent, as a neighbor, as a random person, please hear my voice, ground yourself, reflect on what's going on, because nobody's seeking to be trafficked for attention. Just know. My other favorite thing to talk about with this particular line is there's a great graphic that floats around the internet now, and it says, if you change this quote and you change the word attention to connection, it'll change your response to it. They want connection. Wow, it feels entirely different. Wow. First of all, if they want attention, they need attention. Human need. But let's just change that and share that, gift that to other people, because I'm willing. I mean, I talk about this all the time, and like I got goosebumps when I say it. It's impactful. So impact other people in this really meaningful way. A teenager, when I was in teenage and like just in the throes of grade 9 or 10 or whatever, a girl, I think I said that about a girl, and I was like, she wants attention. And another girl said to me, then she needs attention. And like grade 9 or 10, the agency and tenacity that she said that, I never said it again in my life. It was so impactful. And now I challenge everybody also with the change it to connection. This is one thing we can do to impact the world in a positive, tiny little way that'll have ripple effects. Okay, moving on. All commercial sex is human trafficking. No. Because we now commercial sex in minors is different because the minors cannot sell sexual activity. However, once you're not a minor, that's a different story. So all commercial sex is not human trafficking. In fact, we just looked at the definition of human trafficking, and nowhere on there did it say all commercial sex is human trafficking. So you can just take that right off the roster. And again, if that's something that you ever like, you're like, oh, this is so interesting, I'm going to learn more on the internet. This is different laws everywhere too, like national laws. There may be countries where this is the case. Overwhelmingly, this is not the truth, and it's definitely not any legal truth in Canada. Traffickers target people they don't know. It's the opposite. So, and usually when I'm doing this presentation and we're unpacking the myths, and it's a bit more engaging because we're in person. And I don't have all this up here. I'm waiting for people to say things like this. Somebody will say, oh, when I give the reference, like, when did you learn about trafficking? There's no presentation I've ever been in where the movie Taken was not named. Not a single one. It's always named. And it just perpetuates myths. So it was strangers, it was international borders, all these things. All taking can happen. It can play out exactly like that. It is the exception to the rule, not how it typically plays out. So I can tell you in what I have seen in doing this work in Moncton is the like phrase that's used for like grabbing someone off the street and trafficking is a grab and go. One instance that I didn't support the person, I was supporting someone supporting the person, which is something we offer as well. That was one instance. And I mean, we connect with thousands of youth a year, not in like case management, but we're interacting with thousands of youth and adults really a year, one. So the exception to the rule. So if we take in that media that's almost always telling us that that's how trafficking plays out, we're going to miss it 99% of the time, and that's a big problem. So it's almost always someone that you know through some association. It could be your big brothers, girlfriends, coach. Like it can be a few degrees of separation, but it's almost always connected. The internet, of course, brings in some maybe more stranger danger because it's global, but overwhelmingly it's someone you know. When we first got this project about 5 years ago, and in year one, we were intensively training, so much training. I've never had a budget in a program in my entire career where we didn't intensively train so much, which was really appropriate and really meaningful and really impactful. They said you'll see a lot of trafficking intergenerationally in family homes. And I was like, oh, that's crazy. We'll probably never see that. Often we see that in the cases where we're supporting youth who have previously or are experiencing it or have just gotten out of the situation, which is really notable. So this is something we want to question. We do want to check in with the folks that we know and not assume like, God, it's crazy. It can't be that. Because I too thought that. And this is like the work that we do is overwhelmingly that way. Not all the time. And that's another thing that's really tricky about trafficking is you could say it's this one thing. Like we can look at that definition and say this is what trafficking is. But in reality, it can play out in a million scenarios. So you really got to lean into your gut feeling with something doesn't seem right here. And that's really the starting point from what are we going to do next? And try not to ignore those feelings. Because it's not the stranger. It's someone we know, which makes it a lot more complicated, right? To question that something could be going on here. And you don't have to have all the answers with that. You can reach out to your support system, to us, to social development, to the NB, foster and adoption folks. Like truly everyone's here to support. You don't have to have all the answers. Only women and girls are at risk of being trafficked. I said this in the beginning when I touched on the statistics and the way the statistics lean, that men traffic women and girls. Overwhelmingly, that is the case. But we can't say that that's exclusively how it happens at all. It can happen. I mean, anyone can traffic and anyone can be trafficked. The stats are skewed in one direction. That is the truth. Another truth is that sextortion, which is someone being threatened online to provide something sexual. So they have to pay money, like a nude has been sent, for example, a youth has been groomed or lured or threatened, they send a nude, and now the person's like, if you don't send me $1,000, I'm actually going to put this on YouTube and send it to all your friends. And then they send more money and more money. The targets there are actually boys and gender diverse youth. So the rate of boys being targeted for sextortion have gone up by over 800% in the last 2 years. So with actually incredibly dangerous outcomes. So trafficking is obviously a dangerous and violent thing. The outcomes are pretty terrible for sextortion. And what we know about youth, right, is the brain development. Teens think what other folks think about them is the most important thing in the world. Like in disregard all of that great advice that we've got, that's all they care about. It's not all they care about, but it's part of it's what their brain's telling them and they can't stop it. So when now you've been manipulated, sent the nude, thought it was going to be okay, and now it's going to go to all their friends, and that brain development piece is there. It's the worst thing in the world. I mean, it is a really, really terrible thing. But this is where young people harm themselves and take their lives, unfortunately. So the outcome is not great for sextortion, and the targets are boys with astronomical rates. And all of these issues are underreported. So anybody can traffic and anyone can be trafficked. And it's true, this data is skewed in one direction, but we can't focus on that, just like we can't focus on taken as being the definition of trafficking, because then we're not going to talk to the boys about what to do when it happens to them. In fact, we probably talk to them about like, don't do this to the girls. And we're going to miss a lot, potentially, with that definition. And we'll talk a little bit about how to handle that coming up too. Trafficking, gender diverse youth, I think I said that, gender diverse folks experience higher rates as well, similar to girls. Trafficking and exploitation is always or usually a violent crime. This is an interesting one. Yes, but also no. So trafficking isn't an event, it's a process. So in the beginning of the process, there's luring and grooming. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. But luring and grooming, I always say I'm a professional and I'm good at my job. Traffickers are professionals and they're good at their job, if they're good at their job, which means, what am I saying? There's different kinds of pimps or traffickers. They have all these these names that I didn't make up. So there's a Romeo pimp. They will groom and lure through romance. Everything's feeling good. Boy of my dreams, girl of my dreams, man of my dreams, all my hopes and dreams. Maybe I grew up in a group home and he's like, baby, they don't get you like I do. Like, your family, we're going to build a family. We're going to have a house. I'm going to take care of you. And they're just building off the vulnerabilities. And they discover the vulnerabilities through grooming and luring. Because really what they're doing is collecting information. Oh, you're in a group home. Oh, what's your family like? What's your dog's name? What are you into? What do you hate? Like, who are the people in your life? And then it's held against them. And it's a slippery slope. So if we have what we call the Romeo pimp in that process, but certainly in the early stages where things might feel good, there might not be any violence, but it's almost always introduced. So we'll talk about the stages in a bit, but there's a stage where like there's a new reality and things are being introduced that you maybe never thought would be in your life, and then they're there, and then there's a new reality. And violence is usually where the new reality is more present. But that's the Romeo pimp. There's, I have a booklet with like different kinds of pimps. There are so many. There's another one, the two I talk about though, the Romeo pimp and the gorilla pimp. Gorilla pimp does exact same stages, goes through all the processes, but instead of the feel goods, he's using brute violence. So, and there are others. So is it always violent? I lean towards yes. Can I say 100% of the time? No, it could be deception throughout the entire process, being manipulated through substances, but never hit. Like, there's no hard rule with trafficking, and it's so varied, but it's almost always there, one way or another, if not right away, at some point. Human trafficking involves traveling, moving, or transporting a person across provincial, territorial, national borders. So again, this is that sex tourism in Thailand example that stayed in my head for a good chunk of time. You don't have to move over any border at all. Certainly not a national border. You can, of course. In my work, I don't see that. Might I tomorrow? Sure. Haven't seen it yet. And really, if we're talking to the average person, this is probably one of the first reference points is that traveling is across borders. Taken. Sex tourism Thailand. And these are the narratives that we hear. But I'll tell you, you can actually have you can be sitting on the couch with your partner in the evening watching whatever you're watching. Your 16-year-old, such a good kiddo, they're upstairs in their bedroom doing their homework. Well, they're actually being trafficked in their bedroom because of the internet. So no borders required. And again, we looked at the definition, right? That was the Canadian definition. There was no must go over a border. And the other thing is that I'm just trying to see, should we talk about this now or later? But the other thing is that you can, I've had teachers tell me and survivors tell me that, I was trafficked in the evenings, stayed at home, went to school, had what seemed like maybe a normal life, and was being trafficked in the evenings. I had a high school teacher tell me a couple years ago that he's like, oh, the girls are here on Friday. On Friday night, they go to the big stop. They do run the Halifax, and they're back in class on Monday. Trafficked on the weekends. So, no borders. If the trafficked person consented to their initial situation, it can't be trafficking or against the will because they knew better. Again, you can't consent to being trafficked. You can consent to go party, to drink, to make bad decisions. Like, you can consent to all. You're never consented to being trafficked. It's impossible. It's an oxymoron. It's against the definition. So you can consent to. Someone could say that guy's a trafficker. Don't get in the vehicle, and you're like, well, he offered me a job and getting in the vehicle. You're still not consenting to being trafficked. You're consenting to something else. So there's. No, it's a myth. Yeah. So, is it happening here? It is happening here in New Brunswick. We have terrible statistics, and I'll tell you, anytime you hear a statistic about human trafficking or youth sexual exploitation, you take it with a grain of salt because so many folks don't come forward. for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about that, but they're not coming forward per se. So the Canadian Centre on Human Trafficking, which I highly recommend everyone follow on your social media platforms. They're not a government entity. They're not connected to the police. It was actually created with survivors. They speak a million different languages. You can get supports in so many different ways. They operate Canada's trafficking hotline. But you can text the hotline, you can call the hotline, you can go on the website. And so I recommend following them. So we're getting an education that's relevant and it's not academic, like it's digestible, it's Canadian, and it's giving a different narrative than the Taken narrative. But they're fantastic. You can call them just to be like, oh, I don't know if this is trafficking, or I'm just concerned, or like there was this red, like you can just talk to them and get support. You can safety plan with them. We had a really, really complex case a few years ago with a kid. It was over provincial borders. They were a minor, and we made this safety plan, and we called the center, and no personal information. We're just like, this is the plan. They knew some resources in the other province, and we just bounced the safety plan off them. They're like, that's a great safety plan. So you can really use them. However, don't think that you can't call them because your kid hasn't been trafficked and is missing. It doesn't need to be that at all. You can just be like, I'm having a tough time. They're great. They're free. So they put out some resources, studies, and the data that they get from the hotline. So just interesting, not academic, really boots on the ground, relevant, timely information. So they put out a report about Canada's corridors. So these are the routes that people are typically trafficked, which ones are the most popular, the busiest, where are routes not, that sort of thing. So the busiest corridor identified in Canada was between Moncton and Halifax. Little old sleepy East Coast. So what's notable here, so statistics, take them with a grain of salt. But a regional nuance, and another reason we always want to get regional information, at the very least Canadian information, is because there's just different nuances everywhere. The big stop, the run to Halifax on the weekend, the Trans-Canada, that's a regional nuance. So what's going on there? A lot of things probably I don't know. What's interesting about it is Halifax doesn't have legal strip clubs. Strip clubs are considered like a training ground in the grooming stages for girls and women before they are sold in other ways. So girls are sent from Halifax to Moncton to dance, and then back, and vice versa, and off to different parts of Canada. So regional nuance. Busiest corridor in Canada. And another interesting thing about this, New Brunswick, I always make this terrible joke, you guys. I'm sure you can all relate that New Brunswick is really passionate about being in last place. Ew, we gotta stay there. No, don't give us resources. It's a terrible joke, but I feel the truth of it often enough. And one of them in New Brunswick, there's really no trafficking resources. I can count them on one hand. So this example is, so New Brunswick has no convictions of human trafficking. So what does that mean to some folks who are very statistic based? You have that personality type, whatever it is, you need the numbers. Therefore, there's no trafficking in New Brunswick, right? No problem here. Also, that lack of convictions, which is a systems approach, and it provides proof. When you have the numbers, you can get the funding to create the resources. And there's none here. But what's really interesting about that is Nova Scotia has the highest rates of police-reported human trafficking in Canada per capita and police-reported cases. So it's is this the next slide? It's 7.5 times higher than the national average in Nova Scotia, in Halifax. There's nothing in New Brunswick. We have the busiest corridor in Canada. That doesn't make any sense, right? So I dare say just little Ashley saying this, but I dare say that in Moncton, we probably have some of the highest rates in the country per capita. And we're just not saying that yet because there's no trafficking in New Brunswick. Last place, you guys. So I say this because when we're getting our information from other folks, if we're worried about someone, we're grasping at what we're getting. And that might be there's no trafficking in New Brunswick. There's no problem here. It's not that. There's no border that's gone. Like there's and to just not question your intuition. And if you reach out for help and you get the responses you don't like, just keep reaching out for help. And you can reach out to us at the YW. Yeah. Is it happening here? Let's continue that story. I do all these slides, say, look, folks, it's happening here. But lately, I would say the last 6 months, I haven't had to convince many folks about this at all because it's in the media, not the Taken style. There's been some high profile cases locally, which has been interesting. I've had different people reaching out to me to collaborate and hear about what I'm seeing, boots on the ground, not me, like the YW and the work that we do. But I've worked with or I've spoken with police officers before in the province who say there's no trafficking in New Brunswick. I've had police officers bring me in to do this presentation with police officers, which to me is really interesting. And that's important to know. I mean, that's really interesting because it says that we're not doing specialized training with the people that the average person thinks of as the helper with trafficking. We think call the police, but the police might not be trained on human trafficking. That being said, I've spoken to many RCMP officers in New Brunswick who are like, trafficking is such a problem and we don't have the resources and people don't see it. So there's no paintbrush of the RCMP with the topic in New Brunswick. I've seen huge variations, but it's important to note that just like with a family doctor who might not be trained, they specialize in things, right? RCMP officers and police enforcement folks do as well. So if they haven't experienced it in the field, they might be relying on something they learned in depot, like when they went to RCMP school. Back in the day, they might have had like a 2-hour, 1-hour lecture on it back then and have had no other training since then. So how are they going to see it? How are they going to intervene? All of these things, just something to consider. But again, I've spoken to many police officers who agree that this is a big issue. But the case is in the media right now, and they are advocating really hard to get trafficking informed, like a specialized division for it, which would mean more resources. They're going to get some numbers. And it means that if any one of us here is concerned about someone and we reach out to the RCMP, that we're going to get a trafficking informed response instead of that doesn't exist. This being said, if that ever happens to you, and we're going to talk more about this in a bit, especially with the online stuff, I always recommend that you, especially the online stuff, you report through cybertip.ca because those reports go to the specialized division, the ICE division. They deal with the internet exploitation of children. And I've heard those stories where youth were sextorted. They went in, they reported it, and they had really negative experiences because they just happened to have gotten that staff member who wasn't informed. But again, there are other approaches to that. You can reach out to us and we can advocate. And really the answer is like the RCMP is a chain of command, and we just keep going up and up and up. And we have pre-existing relationships with the RCMP as well, so we can have a good working model there to advocate for vulnerable folks. Yes, so it is happening. I am very busy in my job, so it's definitely happening. So here is the statistics, 7.5 times higher than the national average, police reported. And it can happen anywhere, anytime, by anyone, to anyone. So of those numbers that I always say, take with a grain of salt, anything trafficking related, but with these numbers, they're from the hotline. So 90% of women and girls trafficked. 90% of folks who are trafficked are women and girls. But gender diverse folks experience disproportionate rates as well. Of that 90%, 51% are Indigenous. Pretty mind-boggling. And we'll talk a bit more about some of the vulnerabilities and how that plays into the stages of trafficking in a little bit, but really notable. because they're like 6% of the Canadian population. So it's astronomically disproportionate. Okay, the dick pic slide. You're like, oh my God, what did she just say? Yes, let's address that I just said dick pics. Everybody's a little bit uncomfortable right now. This is intentional. We're gonna talk about it. I promise. It's gonna be okay. The reason I have this slide up here and we talk about it, it's really important, I promise. I imagine, I can't see you all, I don't know how old you all are, but I imagine our realities with the digital world is probably quite different from the youth that brought you into this space tonight. So I grew up for a chunk of my childhood with no reference to the internet. It's the first kid to get it in the family home in my school because my dad is a techie geeky kind of guy. Dial-up in my later teen years. So different reference point, no social media. Well, ICQ and MSN Messenger for those who remember. So if we place this context on the kids of today, which I think we overwhelmingly do, we're missing the mark by leaps and bounds. Because they're in a fishbowl where getting dick pics is super normal. I'm going to share a story with you. And that's important because, I'm going to share a story with you first. So I go around and I do this presentation all the time, right? Adult audiences, youth audiences. And every time, and it's either, it's most typically a class or a school or like the middle school grades at a school, 6, 7, 8, and then grades 9, 10. It's usually chunks. It's not necessarily or often a class. It's usually multiple classes or a school. So I can be presenting to 150 youth, 500 youth, what have you. And this is what I ask them. By a show of hands, put your hand up if you've ever received a dick pic. Depending on the age of the audience, I will say dick pic or nude. And I, at the YWCA, am the Youth and Employment Services Manager. Something notable about that, as the youth manager side of it, is the youth team regularly brings in staff that are youthful. What does this do to me? I like to say it keeps me like relevant with the youth, but as we know, the youth would not agree with that. But it's like a bridge from my reality to the kiddos' reality. And when we first started talking about sending nudes or dick pics, I was using sexting as the language because it was the literature language at the time, certainly. It was a new thing, and it's still referred to that in some places, but some of the younger staff I had at the time, direct quote, "That's so cringe." So cringe. Which is important to note because we have to find a place where we can be on the level with the youth. And if I'm trying to talk to them about online safety and dick pics and I'm saying sexting and I'm so cringe, I've lost them already. So the education there was you nudes. That's the language. Nudes, dick pics, not sexting. The politically correct term is not dick pics either. It is intimate distribution of intimate images. Unconsensual distribution of intimate images, which is just a mouthful. And I actually, in bringing this up, I want to address the discomfort that we all felt. But going back to the story, one, all the kiddos in the audience, put your hand up if you've ever received a unsolicited nude in an inbox somewhere. It could be your email, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, wherever it is. Hands up. Almost all the hands go up. I do this, so it's this presentation, but it's the youth version of this presentation. So it's just language differences, really. So almost all the hands go up. I do this presentation from basically grade 3 to post-secondary. Exact same response every time. So all the hands go up. Everybody's received one. Almost everybody's received one. Okay, hands down. Now put your hands up. For everybody who just put your hands up, how many of those people told a safe adult? Put your hands up. Maybe a few hands go up. I mean, imagine in your mind, imagine an audience of 150 people. I mean, that's a big difference. Okay. So most of us didn't tell safe adults. Next question, hands down. Why? 3 responses. I get them again and again and again and again. Doesn't matter if you're in grade 4, it doesn't matter if you're in university. If we were in person, this would be a guessing game and it's fun. And you guys always guess it. I'm sure like we've got ideas right now. You're it's this. Big one is, I've already said it. That's so cringe. I don't want to talk to my mom about that. No, of course you don't. That's awkward. And I'll share the first time that I had a dick pic. I was 11, very young, no notion of how to use the internet, what the internet was. I used to pick up magazines, go to the ad section to see if they had a www address. And I thought that that was the only way that you could get content, is if you had like just no concept. This is the 90s. This was the 90s. So different. But I was 11. It was the first time I saw a naked boy. And I'm willing to bet it wasn't an 11-year-old who sent me that picture. So that was an educational experience for me. I didn't know things and I learned them there in an unsafe way, meaning it wasn't guided, which I'm sure is quite typical still today in whatever ways we find out about things. However, it was news to me. Did I tell my mom? No, that would have been so cringe, leading us to fear number 2. I was 11 years old. The internet was new. We didn't need it, blah, blah, blah. She was going to take it away. I knew she would take it away. She would have lost her mind. True. That is the second response from the kids. Why aren't you telling them? They don't want the Wi-Fi taken away and they don't want their tech taken away. We're going to talk about that in a bit. That's a hot topic. Okay. Hands down. Or no, wait. So cringe. That's awkward. I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to lose my stuff. And the other one, I think it's the most alarming one. It's no big deal. It's no big deal that I'm being forced to see naked bodies that most probably did not consent to have their naked bodies shown. It's no big deal. So they're getting these nudes, they're dealing with it, and they're moving on with their life. It's so normalized. It's so alarming. That is notable to me because it means entire generations are groomed. Grooming is the stage of trafficking, and they're groomed already. This is normal. No biggie. It's such a big deal. And also we have to talk to the youth and be like, yeah, you're very capable. Like you can't be like, it's such a big deal because you have to be strength-based and connecting. So 3 really, really notable things for, I think, us always to keep in mind as we are scared about what's going on, as we're talking to them. Bringing me back to the dick pic conversation. Think about how you felt physically in your body when I said, oh, the dick pic slide. We're going to talk about dick pics. I literally said it so many times and I'm doing it intentionally because let's check in with our bodies. It feels a little bit awkward or squeamish or something, right? We need to have these conversations with the youth. And I can tell you, if you're that uncomfortable and you already know that they don't want to talk about it with you, how are we going to do it in meaningful and effective ways? Because I know as a parent and someone who's supported vulnerable youth for a long time, we just want to say, don't do this, really, really bad things will happen. Don't do it. I know, just listen to me. I'm not trying to ruin your life. I love you and I'm trying to protect you. We can't do it. It doesn't work. So how do we talk to them about dick pics? And I can tell you, if you think that they don't want to talk about dick pics, it's not true because I go in and I'm like, hey, you guys, I talk about dick pics all the time. Nobody's going to surprise me. Let's talk about it. And they're like, most common example is I have to stop my talk in the middle and come back and finish. There's not enough time to talk about dick pics with kids. They are leaning in. So what's the difference with parents? Is my kid going to want to talk to me about dick pics? I'm going to presume no, and it's not going to go in any like great way. But maybe cool auntie will. Somebody needs to be able to talk to them about dick pics. The other thing is when I talk to kids about the dick pics, is this is how I'm talking about it. I'm joking. I'm like, well, we got to talk about the dick pics, you guys. And they're like, oh my God, she's hilarious. She's so comfortable talking about it. Versus how we felt as a group today, when I started talking about dick pics, that feeling, is it on the outside when we're talking to the kids? Because that's cringe. I'm going in there super confident and being like, oh, let's talk about the dick pics, and they lean in. So there's this parental thing that's different, right? Nobody wants to talk about it with their parents, but there's a comfort level too. And I literally did this exercise for us to assess how uncomfortable it is, that physical reaction we had in our body talking about dick pics. They are swimming in it. It is so normal to them. They don't think they have to talk about it because they can handle it. And they do. They block the guy, they ignore the person, they report it to the platform, whatever it is, they handle it. But that's not the end all and be all of it, right? They can't process abstract ideas. It's we have to guide them, and we have to talk about the dick pics, you guys. And if you don't know how to do it, that's totally okay. And really what I've learned through the brave YW experience over the last few years is that who can we go to as a teenager, any youth, as a teacher, as a caregiver, as a parent? Who can we go to learn all the ins and outs about sending nudes and what's legal and what's not legal and what can we do about it? And I kind of have had the impression that a lot of adults know something about it, whether it's true or not, who knows? But oh, they heard this one thing. I heard this other thing. And then we share that with youth. It may or may not be factual, and it's a page in a book. So it's not this holistic response. It's one thing, and it might be fear-based. And I'm strength-based. Instilling fear, even though it's the natural like reaction to this topic, isn't instilling protective factors because we're not connecting with the youth. One of the biggest protective factors to human trafficking is connection. This is what we want to maintain above everything. And we'll talk a bit more about that. Coming on up. There we go. Okay, so it's so cringe. They don't want to talk about it. Super valid. I also did not want to talk about it. So if we don't know about cybertip.ca, if you take one thing away from this workshop, it is cybertip.ca. I can't say it enough. You can go check out the website. It's awesome. Cybertip.ca has a ton of educational material, generally for an adult audience, although kids can read it. It's not like, don't go there, kids. But the youth version of the information is needhelpnow.ca. So it's like, oh, I sent a nude. Am I going to be charged with child pornography? This is actually the burning question with youth, by the way. Overwhelming answer is no, but it's not as black and white as that. So need help now, kiddos, but cybertip.ca is also for them. But if you want information, I recommend starting with cybertip.ca. But this is where the kids can report the icky stuff online, the dick pics, etc. So what they do, and when I do the youth version of this workshop, we walk through the reporting template together. Why is it so meaningful? We could just call the police. Sure. Cybertip.ca is for Canadian minors. So under 18, I know New Brunswick it's 19, but I don't think that'll fly on Cybertip because it's a federal definition. Cybertip.ca, they can report the icky online stuff anonymously. Don't have to tell my parents. Not only am I reporting it, it's going to the ICE division. So it's going to the people who can say, we've got something we can investigate here, or at least file as part of something, whatever. They have the expertise to recognize what's going on. When I do this with kids, I say, you can report anonymously, but please tell a safe adult. I always preamble that, but some of them will not. And actually, when I do the whole like, who's got a dick pic, put your hands up, who told the safe adult, and all the hands go up. And then I follow up afterwards and I say, so almost all of you did not tell a safe adult. So the caveat to that is though, is when I'm like grades 3, 4, a little bit 5, and I'm like, who told the safe adult? There's always a couple kids. I told my mom. I will tell her every time. And it's not even the bulk, but there, there's always a couple of those kids in their little ages, and like, yes, let's foster that. But they're all telling someone, overwhelmingly, they're telling someone. The question though is who's telling a safe adult? They're all telling their peers. Again, these answers are textbook the same from grade 3 to post-secondary. They're all telling their peers. So what does that mean to us? We have to educate peers to support peers and give good information. So when I go through this, I say, hey, you can report anonymously, super cool. I really hope you're telling a safe adult though. And then I say, especially with like huge, we serve like a wide age demographic, you might never need this information, little grade 4 child, whoever. You might never need this information, but at some point in your journey in life, I promise you, you're probably going to have a friend that could benefit from this information. It might be when you're 18, it might be when you're 25, like and maybe never. But this information, because they're all telling their peers. So not only are you going to be able to give them a resource, you're going to be able to give them good information that could make an impactful difference in their life. I did this presentation in the fall, November, for the Youth Mental Health Summit that Anglophone East does. So they get all the grade 9s and 10s, I think, from Greater Moncton area, and they're brought together for like a youth conference for the day on mental health topics. And I've presented there the last couple of years, and same thing every year. It's how to report on cyber tips and luring and grooming and love bombing and that sort of thing. And the feedback this year after we got it was on my workshop. That was so interesting. I'm going home to report a whole bunch of online pervs.
Mm.
So it is impactful to the youth. Cyber tip, cyber tip, cyber tip, cyber tip. Big one.
I didn't know about this one, so that was a really good one to find out. I know that on our certain local police stations, they now have reports you can do anonymously. So I've referred youth to doing it that way, but this
Yeah.
is even better. So
Yes, and that's a great point because there's a few, like there's Crime Stoppers too, and that's another one with adults too, because CyberTip is youth specific, but there's lots of information on there. Like I recommend going there, whoever you are. But Crime Stoppers is another good one that we can refer folks to. And I don't actually know, but what's unique about CyberTip is that it goes to the ICE division. So does Crime Stoppers? I don't know. And maybe it's that if they receive something trafficking related, they bring in someone who specializes in that. That's my hope. But we're in New Brunswick, so I don't actually know if that's the case. But we'll get there. Okay. And they actually, oh, my pen just flew. They actually, you can go on their website and request free resources. So there's posters and how to talk to a kid, how to talk to a parent, and they ship it for free to your house. Okay. Warning signs. Take all of this with a grain of salt. Everyone is not being trafficked. I feel like all these signs can be like, but I've got a teenager or a struggling teenager.
quick question for you, Ashley. The question is, what age is most targeted? Do
This is
we
a good
have
question.
statistics on that?
Yeah, well, yes and no. Statistics in me and trafficking is such a grain of salt. So I don't lean on them. There are statistics. I don't think they're true. And it really depends on where the statistics coming out of. So a lot of statistics in Canada come out of Ontario. They've got the highest rates and blah, 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 blah. And where are they getting those statistics from? So often they're from police reports. And lots of folks don't go to the police. Or is it only from social development? Like, where are they getting it? And there's regional nuances. Ontario's got the 401, like there's, again, just regional nuances. So different things. I've heard as young as 8. And in the in-person workshop, I show some videos. And what I can do actually is I can send a follow-up email to you, Jessica, with some resources. And some of those in there are
Perfect.
videos that kind of address this question. There's no hard and fast answer, I think, but as young as 8, 12 to 15, I think everybody in the field could agree on, but I would challenge it and say younger. And so there's this example. It's one of the videos that would be in this list that folks could access. You could always reach out to me at the YWCA, but there's this example. Someone told me in one of the workshops that it was a show on Discovery Channel. But these folks who are skilled in this stuff pretended to be someone to draw out traffickers and pimps, and then they arrest them, and it's all filmed. So in this one example, it's really, really impactful. And you guys, like, I specialize in trafficking, so I see or hear awful stories. And this story was like fake. It was like they set someone up. They weren't really a kid. They were pretending to be a kid. It is the video that I remember sitting at my desk just crying. So really, really impactful. And so they set up a social media platform on Facebook, I think it was, to be, I think they started at 11. They did really good. They made a whole fake friend list. They studied youth and their mannerisms and their language. And then they digitally edited a woman on the team who could present very young, but I think was actually 40. And they just manipulated her digitally to look a smidge younger. Did all the poses that teens do and posted it on there. And then they put it live, and they were recording when it went live to see how quickly people started reaching out to this youth for to exploit her. And it was fast. It's fast, and it was gross. It was shocking. I specialize in this stuff, you guys, and it was shocking. So they repeated the process and they went younger, and I think they went down to 8. It's been a while since I've watched that one. And it was worse and it was faster. And imagine the vulnerability of an 8-year-old versus an 11-year-old. So young, like I dare say younger than we're willing to imagine. But I think a lot of the brochures would say those early teen years. So what are we looking for, folks? Again, grain of salt. You can have all this stuff on the screen and not be trafficked. And you can have none of these things and be trafficked. And there are more. These are really the youth specific ones, but some of these can apply to adults. I could put up an adult one and they could apply to youth as well, but these are really the things that we see in the work that we do, the things that you might notice. But I want to tell you to take it with a grain of salt. And what is a red flag, yes, is all of these things. The biggest thing is the folks who know that person thinking something is off. I can't quite figure out what this is. This is the biggest red flag I want everyone to listen to and to lean into, and to how's that connection? Are they connected to someone safe, to watch, to observe, to check in, just to check in, and to educate yourself about what you can do from that place, to call the center, to hash it out, to call us, whatever it might be. This is the biggest piece that we can do that I think far outpaces anything that's on here. But these are some of the notable things. My dog's barking at the door. She'll get let out, but if you hear the barking dog, that's what's going on. So school, I gave an example earlier that they can remain in school. So we might think that the red flag is that they've just disappeared and they're no longer in school. They could be fully attending school, but maybe now they're falling asleep in class and they weren't before. Maybe there was extracurriculars that were like, this kid's going to college to do this and they're not doing it anymore. Maybe there's bruises and burns. Maybe the grades have slipped, but they're there. Maybe attendance isn't perfect anymore. Schools are really critical interveners in this because they so consistently see the kids. Even if school is a negative experience, they still day in, day out see the kids. And even if their normal is not stable, they can see what's consistent over time. So they can really see this stuff. Control. It might be that, there's the new boyfriend or girlfriend, and you're sitting around the supper table and you ask your daughter a question and she turns to the boyfriend for the answer and lets the boyfriend respond. So control, I mean, you might think of like physically, like controlling someone, but it's those small little ways. Again, is something off? I've never seen my daughter, my son this way. What's going on? Appearance might change, and it might change a smidge or it might change in big ways. So girls are often made to be hypersexualized because at the end of the day, that is a product to a trafficker to be sold sexually. So they're hypersexualized. So maybe it's tighter clothes, maybe it's skirts and tank tops. Maybe it's makeup where makeup wasn't there before. Nails are done, lashes are done. These are expensive. I've literally, you guys, never had my nails or my lashes done. And I hear what people pay for them. And I'm like, wow, I couldn't afford to get it done if I wanted to get done. But kids are getting them done. It's trending. Don't be like, oh my God, my teens all have their nails done. It's such a thing with kids. But if you cannot wrap your head around how they consistently have nice nails and hair done because you know where they work, and what they make, maybe that's something to question. Did it come along with a whole appearance change, a new boyfriend, the dropping grades, you just having this nagging feeling that something was off? This is one of the signs of human trafficking. Something doesn't feel right. I won't go through everything on here. This is highly Googleable. You can really Google this information, but I do want to talk about some of the things that stick out to me as a mom, as someone who works with youth, all of that jazz. The kids can talk about love bombing. Love bombing, if you don't know, is a ton of affection, quick and fast at the start of a relationship. Without context of what a healthy relationship is, that might feel really good. He loves me so much. She loves me so much. All this attention I'm getting. Oh my God, he called me 30 times today. How sweet. So it's super toxic, abusive, total lack of respect, lack of boundaries, power indifference, potentially these things. So we need to break down love bombing if we see it and name that sort of stuff. Talk about boundaries like, oh, you were in class for an hour and a half and he called you 30 times. Probably knew you were in school. So that's not really respectful of your personal time, is it? So you kind of have to break it down in really tangible ways with what's going on. And a lot of the kids that we're going to work with didn't see healthy relationships modeled. They might even be able to say, yeah, hitting's bad and like I would never let anyone do this. But in reality, it's very different and it's not modeled. And really, the work starts with us. We are, in so many ways, the same product of them, of our culture, of our society, of all these things. So we can reflect on all these things first. Do I model a healthy relationship? Do I talk about things in a strength-based way? Do I doom and gloom the internet? Because right away, we're fracturing a really important connection with the youth if we only doom and gloom the internet. So many great things from the internet. Look at us all tonight. You know, we wouldn't be doing this without the internet. Think of COVID. What would we have done without the internet? So we really have to, if we're going to say some of the risks about the internet, we really have to follow it up with some wonderful things about the internet for the purpose of maintaining that connection, which is ultimate protection of human trafficking. They can be trafficked, and this is still the most important thing. If there's nothing else you can do, you can say, I love you, and my door is always open to you, and never change that. The connection is the most important thing. This is the age of consent to sexual activity. It starts at 16 in Canada, but it actually starts at 12. So at 16, it doesn't really matter how old the person is above them. They just can't be in a position of power authority. They can't be selling sexual services if they're a minor, but like 16 plus, you can engage in sexual activities. 12 years old is actually where it starts, but there's exceptions. So a 12 and a 13-year-old can only go up to 2 years older than them, 5 years for 14 and 15. Again, we're not talking about not selling sexual services in a lot of the consent education. So if we can remember that, that's a big piece. So we're working with these super vulnerable kiddos. What do we want to do? We've talked about the risks, what's going on, the ocean that they're swimming in, the dick pics. We want to talk about healthy relationships. We want to model them. We want to reflect as our own, because who taught us about healthy relationships and consent? Literally, until I was in university, my only reference point to consent, zero consent education at any point in my schooling. Consent was a form to go on a field trip. End story. So we have to check in with ourselves too, because the kids are leaps and bounds ahead of us in some ways, and we have to level the playing field. Got to talk about boundaries. We tell kids like, maintain your boundaries, say no, do this, blah, blah, blah. Do we talk about what it feels like to put in a boundary? Do we talk about you don't have to be polite to put in a boundary? Do we talk about you don't owe anybody anything? Do we talk about how we're raised as Canadians to be hyper polite and that's not always a good thing? Like, do we really unpack what it is to maintain a boundary? Because actually putting a boundary in feels awful and we want to retract right away and then we want to apologize. So if we're not unpacking these like social nuances with this stuff, like we can do better. We need to do better. And it starts with us. Model it, teach it, talk about it. Find popular culture references, huge with youth. Remember the Johnny Depp thing in the media? I didn't follow it super closely, but it was a really high profile case with intimate partner violence. Huge disparities of power, age, all these things. Everybody wanted to talk about it at the time. these are things that you can hook the youth and talk about these topics. So if it's so cringe and you don't want to do it, there are ways to do it. Popular culture, media stories are a big one. If you're not on TikTok, if you're not on Snapchat, and I get it, you can't keep up with it. Like it's always changing. I don't want to. I'm not a social media person. You need to be where the youth are. Because if you don't know that they're swimming in a fishbowl and they're all groomed and all of these things, and you can't connect with them on the platform, like an equal ground, you're always just going to be that mom. So you gotta put yourself what's really in a place with things that are really important to them, which is social media. If you can't, like, I don't TikTok. Again, having youthful staff sometimes is a huge benefit. I didn't understand how TikTok worked. They told me, I was like, wow, I never would have guessed that. The only TikTok videos I see are on my social, on Facebook. Be on TikTok if the only person you follow is your kid, because then when you're driving somewhere, you could be like, oh my God, do you know what I saw on TikTok the other day? It was the craziest thing. And they'll probably be like, you know what I saw on TikTok? It's not about TikTok, it's about the connection. And the kids are on TikTok. If we can't understand how they are manipulating digital spaces, how are we ever going to give protective factors to their vulnerability, which is often accessing digital spaces? Well, let me tell you a little story. I was at Olton's last year doing this presentation, and I was talking about TikTok. Something I learned about TikTok that blows my mind, it still does, is that Google and TikTok will outpace Google for daily site traffic sometimes. Rocked my world when I learned that. What? TikTok, Google? Now they go like this. It's like 1 and 2. They're constantly outpacing each other. I mean, actually, I couldn't say that. There's a lot of political context that is maybe changing that right now, but that has been the truth for the last few years. I say this to the Olden's crowd last year, and they respond with like another one. She was like, oh yeah, like what I was saying was like, you're so old, Ashley. They do their research for college on TikTok. They write their papers from TikTok. TikTok is Google to them. This was last year. My brain was not in that reality that TikTok is being used as Google. And I'm like, your teacher's here. Shh. How do you reference those sources? But anyways, be on TikTok just to follow the kids. Be on Snapchat just to follow the kids. Do you know about the ghost map on Snapchat? And if you're on Snapchat, you might know what I'm talking about. And if you don't know, it's good reason to be where they are just so you can learn about it. So if you don't know about the ghost map on Snapchat, you can turn on your Snap Map, which just you turn on this map, it shows you where you are, and it shows where all your friends are who are on Snapchat on the map. So Sally's 2 streets over, George is across Moncton. You can turn that on and it's live. I can click on my friend on there and it will follow her on the map if she's moving. And then I'll get directions to where she is. 2 things. As a parent, you're like, awesome, worried about my kid, turning the Snap Map on. Second thing, if you're a trafficker, super easy to access the kids. Something to think about. Why is that important? Just being there with the youth will give you a reference point to talk about it with them. Oh my God, I was on TikTok the other day, Snapchat, and they're telling me about the ghost map, and just play dumb a lot with the social media stuff with kids. How does that work? Because they know, and it's going to give them an empowerment piece to engage. I am noticing the time right
I
now.
was just about to interrupt you. Yeah.
I'll wrap it up really quickly and we'll go to questions.
Okay.
Basic needs met. If basic needs are not met, highly able to be trafficked. Because if you don't have a roof over your head and food to put in your mouth, you're going to find a way to put a roof over your head and food in your mouth. Because there's always that one guy who said you could crash on his couch. And we see this. We see this with the teens, especially that 16 to 18-year-old bracket. I hit my mom. I'm leaving. I'm now a runaway and I have a couch to crash on. This is unfortunately what we've seen too many times with that very specific 16 to 18-year-old bracket. So your house is always a safe house. Of course you have rules, but I'll end this piece with this story before we go into questions. There was a dad who was sharing, I was in a workshop and it was for, the facilitator was a mom whose daughter was trafficked. And now she does this work. And she shared the story, or a man in the group shared the story that my dad, when I was growing up, he had sisters, always said, if you get pregnant, you're kicked out of the house. None of the girls got pregnant, so that was a good method. So when he had daughters, he used the same thing. Anybody gets pregnant, you're out of this house. Lo and behold, his daughter got pregnant, kicked her out of the house. She had a couch to go on because there was that guy who always promised it. She was trafficked. Your love and your safety and security knows no bounds. Your kid can make all the mistakes, the most dangerous mistakes in the world, and your door is open and it's never shut, and you love them no matter what. No criteria on your affection. There are things we can say no to. We can say no to giving out money and blah, blah, blah. But the door, your home is always open because they will manipulate that. Your parents don't know you. They'll play off it. Okay. Lots more. I think you'll get, can we send the slides, Jessica?
Yep, definitely.
Yep. And I think some of this will probably come up in the question times. You'll get the slides. We're just missing a couple. Very Googleable information, I want to say too. Know that everybody's groomed. We think of kids and who's going to be trafficked as being groomed, but families and communities are groomed. That's really, really important to know. So we need to believe folks when they speak up. Everybody has a role to play. Whatever your profession is, whatever your job is, whoever your neighbors are, anti-trafficking work and ending this is not a professional's job. It's not that person's job. It's not the police's job. Everybody here has a role, and I dare say that everybody here has a really, really impactful job because you're the one who knows the vulnerable youth, so you're going to be the one that's going to see something that's off. And these are all the people, and I bet a bunch of us are reflected in this who are here tonight, even though we're here as caregivers. So this is where you can reach out to us. You can bring us into any of your workplaces, any of your groups. There's no cost. We're very happy to do the work. And some of these workshops are public, so you could sign up for ones that we do throughout the year if you don't bring us in. This is I think there's a feedback survey from the NB Adoption Foundation as well. This one is Brave specific. You don't have to do it right now, but if you don't mind giving some feedback, you could take a screenshot or a picture and follow that QR code later. Your feedback's really, really important to me. We always take it meaningfully, and it informs our work. So,
and we do have you coming back again on April 3rd as well.
yes.
I think we should probably mention that as well, to
Yes.
talk about the online world and how we can support our youth in that way, in a more practical way. So that would be a great webinar to catch as well.
Yes, it'll focus so much more on the online stuff, which I think is probably really, really impactful for the audience here. So anything where you were like, let's talk about the next one is all on that stuff. So I hope to see you there.